The procedure for sustaining President Harold B. Lee for the reorganization of the First Presidency and the sustaining of all other general authorities and general officers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
All those who can raise your right hand.
Thank you.
You may lower your hand.
It is unanimous.
It was a Saturday night ritual that lasted for decades. Families gathered around the television after dinner, church meeting houses filled with members who had already sat through 2 sessions that day and came back anyway. Leaders spoke from the conference center in Salt Lake City while saints from Sao Paulo to Seoul to Sydney tuned in, some of them in the middle of the night, because that was what devotion looked like. The Saturday evening session of General Conference wasn't just a scheduling convenience. For generations of Latter-day Saints, it was the heartbeat of a weekend that defined what it meant to belong to this church. On November 19, 2025, the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints announced that beginning in April 2026, that heartbeat would stop permanently. No Saturday evening session, not this year, not next year, not ever again. The official reason? To increase focus on the 4 daytime sessions. 4 words that explain nothing and raise everything. In this video, you're going to discover the full history of Saturday Evening General Conference and why it meant so much to members who grew up in the church during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You're going to find out exactly what the First Presidency announced, who signed it, and what the official language carefully avoids saying. You're going to hear the real questions that longtime members, especially those over 60 who gave half a century to this institution, are quietly asking themselves. And you're going to explore what this change, stacked on top of every other change the church has made in the last decade, actually signals about where the LDS Church is heading and who it is becoming. If you've ever sat through a Saturday evening session as a believer, or if you left a church that felt increasingly unrecognizable before you walked out the door, stay with me until the end, because this one matters. This channel exists for people who ask the questions the institution won't answer. If that's you, hit the like button right now. It tells the algorithm this content deserves to be seen. And subscribe so you never miss what we publish next. We go deep on the LDS Church, the history they don't teach in Sunday school, the decisions they don't explain, and the questions they hope you stop asking. Subscribe. You belong here. The Saturday Night Ritual. What this session actually was. To understand why the elimination of this session hit so hard for longtime members, you have to go back to what Saturday Evening General Conference actually was, not just logistically, but spiritually and socially. In the earlier decades of the 20th century, General Conference was a much more fluid affair. Sessions were held in the Tabernacle on Temple Square. Attendance was mostly local, and the format evolved gradually as the church grew. But by the time the church entered the television age, something consolidated. The weekend of conference became a structured experience with clearly defined moments. And the Saturday evening session carved out a very particular identity. For much of the 1970s and into the 1980s, that session was the Priesthood session, an event exclusively for men and boys who held the Aaronic or Melchizedek priesthood. It was a rite of passage. Young men remembered the first time their fathers took them. They wore their Sunday clothes on a Saturday night, sat in a chapel or drove to a stake center, and listened to apostles speak directly to them as holders of divine authority. It was intimate in a way that the general sessions were not. The priesthood session felt like a meeting within a meeting, the inner circle addressing the inner circle. Women had their own parallel tradition in the General Relief Society, Young Women, and primary broadcasts that preceded conference weekends and held enormous meaning for women who felt seen and addressed by their faith. This separation, which many members of that era accepted without question, would later become one of the pressure points that forced the church to rethink its Saturday evening format entirely. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the model remained remarkably stable. The satellite dish era made it possible for members everywhere to watch from their local meeting houses, and General Conference became one of those fixtures of LDS life that felt permanent, precisely because it never seemed to change. Members scheduled their autumn and spring weekends around it. Conference Saturday evening meant the priesthood holders came home with notes, and the conversation around the dinner table turned to which apostle had said something memorable. For members who are now in their 60s and 70s, these aren't nostalgia points. They are the architecture of a religious life. The Saturday evening session wasn't just content, it was cadence. It told you where you were in the rhythm of the year. Then came the 21st century, and the rhythm started shifting. The first serious tremor arrived in 2018, when President Russell M. Nelson, newly installed as prophet, began what would become one of the most rapid periods of institutional restructuring in the church's modern history. Home-centered church replaced the 3-hour Sunday block with a 2-hour meeting and a curriculum designed to be completed at home. Families were suddenly responsible for a portion of their own religious education in a way the church had never formally structured before. For believers, it was presented as inspired and progressive. For observers, it was the beginning of a pattern. Reduce the meeting structure, emphasize the essential, and call it revelation. By 2021, the Saturday evening session was already in the crosshairs. In June of that year, the church quietly announced it would be discontinued. The reasoning was framed as simplification. Almost immediately, the backlash among faithful members was significant enough that by July 2021, barely a month later, the announcement was reversed. The Saturday evening session would continue, now reconstituted as a general session open to everyone, men and women alike, with no specific priesthood or auxiliary designation. It was a reset, not a cancellation. That reversal mattered. It told you something about where member sentiment was. People cared about this session in a way that the institutional leadership had underestimated. The church blinked. The session came back. And for 3 more years, it continued as part of a 5-session general conference. But November 2025 brought a different announcement, from a different leadership configuration, and this time with no reversal in sight. The November 2025 announcement, reading between the lines. The statement from the First Presidency, dated November 19, 2025, is worth reading carefully, not just for what it says, but for what it chooses not to say. The announcement states that beginning in April 2026, General Conference will no longer include a Saturday evening session. The reason given is to increase focus on the 4 daytime sessions and to emphasize the morning and afternoon meetings. It was signed by Dallin H. Oakes, Henry B. Eyring, and D. Todd Christofferson, reflecting the new configuration of the First Presidency following the transition from Nelson's tenure. That is the entirety of the official explanation. Increase focus. Emphasize daytime sessions. There is no mention of global member distribution and the logistical challenges of broadcasting a Saturday evening American session to Asia, Europe, or Latin America, where the time difference makes evening viewership deeply inconvenient. There is no mention of post-pandemic changes in participation at the conference center or in local meeting houses, where anecdotal reports have long suggested declining in-person attendance at conference watch events. There is no mention of a reduced pipeline of apostolic content, no discussion of production costs, no acknowledgement of any internal data about viewing habits or membership engagement. The official explanation is essentially circular. We are eliminating a session to focus more on the sessions we are keeping. For longtime observers of LDS institutional communication, this kind of compressed language is familiar. The church tends to announce decisions as directives rather than arguments. But the gap between the explanation offered and the plausible reasons behind the decision is wide enough to drive a very large question through. The real reasons, nobody is officially saying. The LDS Church has spent the last decade systematically reducing the structural demands on its membership. The 3-hour Sunday block became 2 hours. Weekly home teaching was rebranded as ministering, with less frequency expected. Youth programs were simplified. The name Mormon was formally discouraged. Temples have multiplied in number, while some older traditions tied to temple attendance have been quietly adjusted. The overall direction, whatever language the church uses to describe it, has been toward less time required, less institutional structure to navigate, less content to consume, fewer obligatory moments in your calendar. This can be framed charitably as the church becoming more intentional, stripping away the peripheral to protect the essential. It can also be framed as an institution responding to a membership that is less willing, or less able, to give as much of its time, energy, and presence as previous generations were. The data on LDS membership is complicated by the fact that the church does not publish its internal activity rates or define membership by attendance. But researchers and former members who have studied demographic trends point to patterns that are consistent across faith communities in the developed world. Younger generations are leaving in higher numbers, geographic concentrations of active members are shifting, and the post-pandemic recovery of in-person religious participation has been uneven at best. If fewer people are watching the Saturday evening session with the same devotion that older generations brought to it, Eliminating it becomes easier to justify, both institutionally and practically. You don't hold a dinner party for guests who have mostly stopped coming, but that framing creates a problem the church cannot easily acknowledge, that a decision driven by declining engagement must be presented as a decision driven by increased focus. The announcement cannot say, "We are simplifying because participation is lower." It has to say, "We are focusing to strengthen what remains." And for members who have been active for 40, 50, or 60 years, those two sentences land very differently. The emotional register of longtime members in response to this announcement deserves serious attention, because it is not what critics might assume. This is not primarily anger. It is something quieter and harder to name, a kind of grief that long-term believers carry when the institution they built their lives around continues to become less recognizable to them. Think about what Saturday evening General Conference represented for someone who joined the church in 1972 and attended every April and October session since. That is over 100 Saturday evenings in some form or another. Priesthood meetings with fathers and sons, general sessions with families, streaming conferences from the couch with grandchildren. The session was a container for memory. It was the place where specific talks were heard that changed the direction of a life, where testimony was renewed in the middle of an ordinary weekend, where connection to global church leadership felt immediate and personal. To be told that this session is over, not temporarily adjusted but permanently eliminated, is not merely to lose an event on a calendar. It is to lose a location in one's spiritual geography. And this loss does not exist in isolation. It sits on top of the erosion of the name Mormon, which many older members actually loved and identified with for decades before being told it was a victory for Satan. It sits on top of the reduction of Sunday meetings from 3 hours to 2, which some senior members initially resisted precisely because they didn't want less. They wanted the full experience they had come to value. It sits on top of the shift toward home-centered curriculum that felt, to some, less like empowerment and more like the church outsourcing its own responsibilities. Each individual change was presented as improvement. But for a certain generation of believer, the cumulative effect is the feeling of watching a beloved house being renovated room by room until it no longer looks like the place where you were raised. At the October 2025 General Conference, held only weeks before the elimination announcement, the church announced 55 new missions to be organized beginning in July 2026. This is a significant number, and it was presented with considerable enthusiasm as evidence of global expansion and missionary momentum. On the surface, it seems to contradict a narrative of institutional contraction, but the announcement of new missions and the elimination of a conference session are not necessarily in tension. The church can be simultaneously expanding its geographic footprint, particularly in Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of Latin America, while streamlining its institutional apparatus for a North American and European membership base that is demographically older, more questioning, and less uniformly engaged than it was a generation ago. The two realities can coexist. What is growing is not necessarily what is losing a Saturday evening session. And what is losing a Saturday evening session may not be what is generating the missionary enthusiasm behind 55 new missions. This is the complexity that the church's institutional communications tend to flatten, and that outside observers have the freedom to examine more honestly. The LDS Church of 2026 is not a single organism moving in one direction. It is an institution managing two very different populations simultaneously: a younger, growing, globally distributed membership in the developing world, and an older, more questioning, increasingly post-institutional membership in the places where the church was once culturally dominant. Reducing conference sessions is a message to the second group. Opening new missions is a message to the first. Both messages are real. Neither cancels the other out. The Saturday evening session of General Conference will be heard for the last time in October 2025. By the time April 2026 arrives, the conference center will go dark on Saturday night, and the next morning's session will begin with one fewer memory attached to it. For the men who sat in those priesthood meetings as teenagers and felt, perhaps for the only time in their week, that they were part of something larger than themselves. That session is already gone in everything but name. For the women who built their own traditions into those conference weekends across decades, that session ends now. And for the people who showed up on Saturday evenings faithfully for half a century, who built their spiritual identity in part through the discipline of being present when they didn't have to be, the silence on that particular Saturday in April 2026 will not be neutral. The church calls this a step toward greater focus. What it actually represents is a reckoning with time, with how much of it members are willing to give, with how much of it a changing world will accommodate, and with how much of it an institution can claim before the faithful begin to wonder whether the institution is still worthy of what they've already given. Every piece removed from a structure changes the structure, not always enough to make it fall, but always enough to make it different. And when you have spent 50 years inside a structure you believed was eternal and divinely designed, watching it become different, piece by piece, session by session, year by year, that is not a theological abstraction. It is personal. It is cumulative. And it ends not with a dramatic break, but with a Saturday night that simply no longer comes. If this video gave you something real, share it with someone who grew up in the LDS Church, whether they're still in or have long since left. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. This channel covers what the institution won't say about itself. The LDS Church, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Seventh-day Adventists, and every organization that asks for your entire life and calls it faith. New videos every week. Subscribe, hit the bell, and we'll see you in the next one.